Okay, I seem to have my computer back functional again. I was knocked off. I'm going to wait until I see that I'm online again before I continue. And, okay. Okay, so now I seem to be back. I hope you're seeing me. So, let me just read the last paragraph that I was reading before we got knocked off. He was one who lived his life absolutely devotedly and sincerely, according to his best convictions, only to discover too late that it still could be understood as a compensation. If that was the experience of the finest, truest man who ever lived, what could I expect? Moreover, the fact that he had preceded me in that fate ennobled my experience and gave me the strength to endure it. I knew through the writings of Jung and Edward Edinger that this is the destiny of modern man, to live our lives as consciously as we can, and to see at the end that it was nevertheless full of error. Living Christ's fate makes all of us God's sons and heirs. This knowledge gave me understanding, which gave me courage. I knew my struggle was meaningful because it resembled Christ's. Okay. Thank you for coming back, those of you who did. I'm sorry I got knocked offline, but I have reread that portion of the book. I was reading from Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology by Lawrence W. Jaffe. And now I will go on to some other things. Okay, so where does religion fit in to the whole story of what we're talking about, and how does religion fit into it? That's the question. And so this comes into the context of this battle between logic and instinct. And Dr. Edinger talked about three big cuts of religious experience through time. One was the Jewish experience, which was based on the law and based on the Ten Commandments, among other things, that Moses brought up about 1200 BC. And then in the second phase came the Savior, and that was belief. And so it gave us moral societies, but it had a problem because of the scientific method putting holes in the ideas. And so finally, now we're moving into a new phase when psychology and individuation itself can create moral people. But I want to refer you back to this book, The New God Image by Edward Edinger, and keeping in mind that we're again talking about this figure that Edinger put into the Ion Lectures, his book called The Ion Lectures. And this book is based on 14 letters that Jung wrote in the last decade of his life, which pretty much described what he's talking about in this book. And I have read all 14 of those letters onto the channel by permission of Chiron Publications, and those letters pretty much sum up the points that he makes in this book. And so I urge you to get it and take a look at it. But he's describing 6 different phases of religious development in human beings. Okay, the first stage was animism, and this was based on primitive people. He said the primitive psyche experiences autonomous spirits everywhere, in animals, in trees, in places, in rivers. The whole surrounding environment is animated, which is why it's called animism. Okay. Then the next phase is number 2 is matriarchy. The animism phase historically belongs to the hunting and gathering traits of humanity. As soon as agriculture is discovered, hunting and gathering becomes less important, and the more settled community that tills the earth takes on primary importance. We then get the matriarchal stage of the God image, in which the great nourishing Earth Mother is the primary factor. The third stage is called hierarchical polytheism. So sufficient produce and resources have now been acquired by the community so that cities can start to develop. There is the emergence of urban society. At this stage, the masculine principle begins to supersede the feminine principle. A family of deities begins to emerge with a patriarchal sky god as the head of the family. The powers of the various deities are organized in a hierarchical way, with the sky god father as the king. Simultaneously, kingship is born. And the polytheism of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece are all examples of this third stage, as is the mythology of Norse and Germanic peoples. The third stage is called tribal monotheism. This stage was discovered or created by the ancient Hebrews. The fact I put it both ways is significant. The question always arises. The question comes just from examining this chart, which is responsible for the transformation of the God image. On the other hand, the God image has within it a latent dynamic tendency to evolve and develop. On the other hand, there is evidence to indicate its development and dynamism results from the feedback it receives from conscious egos. So this is where the law comes in as the Jews, the Hebrews. Then comes universal monotheism. That's the 5th stage. And so in universal monotheism, with the emergence of Christianity, the tribal monotheism of ancient Israel was universalized. It became available to the nations. One of the major features of early Christianity was that Yahweh's promise to the tribe Israel was disseminated to everyone. It was stolen from the Jews, so to speak, and given to the Gentiles, to the gents, to the nations. The monotheism of one tribe becomes available to all tribes, all gents. The other feature of this new God image was that it split into 2 in the course of becoming all good. You see, Israel's Yahweh is a father god, and Christianity's God image is a son god. However, as Jung has elaborated, Yahweh had 2 sons, Christ and Satan. In order for Yahweh to turn into the all-good Christ's son, he had to split off the all-bad Satan's son, who nevertheless remained lurking around to be dealt with sooner or later. The latent dualism that was within the monotheistic God image becomes even more overt in Christian symbolism, even though that fact has been assiduously disregarded. As Jung has demonstrated in Ion, this antithesis then lived itself out in the Christian eon. The first half of the eon was under the aegis of Christ, the first fish, and then the second half of the eon was under the aegis of Satan, the second fish. And he also points out here the heresy of Marcion, called the Marcion problem, because here's what he says. Marcion, a good example of one aspect of the problem, lived from about 90 AD to 160. He was a Christian heretic who maintained that the God of love, as revealed by Christ, had nothing to do with Yahweh, the God of law. According to Marcion, they were totally separate deities. Thus, he rejected the whole Old Testament and a good bit of the New Testament, too. Yahweh was the just God. The Christian God was the good God. Well, the emerging church rejected that heresy. Had Marcion prevailed, there would have been no continuity. There would have been a total split in the historical sequence, so that what we witness would not be a progressive evolution of the God image, which keeps the psyche connected to its roots, but instead there would be a dissociation from the source. And then he quotes Jung from Mysterium Conjunctionis, paragraph 521. Any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral, but the dominant that grows from historical roots acts like a living being within the ego-bound man. He does not possess it, it possesses him. And then the final phase that Edinger talks about then is individuation, or psychology. Individuation, this discovery of the psyche, refers to the psychological level, which understands religious imagery as the phenomenology of the objective psyche. On this subject, Jung wrote Answer to Job and Ion in 1951, and at that time he still had 10 years to live. The second volume of Letters from 51 to 61 covers his last 10 years and includes the 14 letters that I mentioned that I have read into the channel. So that's the new God image and what Jung was saying about religion there. Let me go back and see what comments I've drawn here. Let's see. So Thomas says, quite well summed up, though, is Edinger's description of the course of Jung's works and their connection to religion. Yes. Vincent says, she got quite upset, Gray. Either way, I would like to read the paper in her drawer, and all of us would. Thomas says, 40 years ago, they told us we'd be driving flying cars. I'm sorry, I've gone back too far. Gray says, or Thomas says, I've learned to mistrust predictions of great good change and progress. Yes, I think we all have done that now. And Gray says, evolution is a conservative process. Mallory says, indeed. Andy says, evolution is an emergent property. Yes. And Andy also says, sufficient complexity plus evolutionary catalyst. And Truth Convoy says, hello. Grace says, well said, Andy. All right. So anyway, we're back online, and most of you have returned. I think we knocked a couple off. And so I have often referred to the quote in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, which I will just read in case you're new to this, which is, But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the physis. And so the significant point here is that all religion is about the psyche. It's not about what's up there in the cosmos, except just peripherally. I ought to mention a couple more books, because it was Edinger that finally pulled most of Jung's late works out of oblivion and showed them to be religiously oriented. And before I get into that, there is this book, The Encounter with the Self, which is a Jungian commentary on William Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job. Now, I have read this book, including all of the plates, William Blake's plates, and you will find that in Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour if you haven't read it already. And so Edinger himself wrote 17 books, but one of the, a couple of them are here. One is The Christian Archetype, a Jungian commentary on the life of Christ, by Edward F. Edinger. Another is The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament, again by Edward F. Edinger. I guess I can lose the figure at this point. And another one is Archetype of the Apocalypse, again by Edward F. Edinger. And this is his book about Revelation, among other things. And it's a very powerful book. What I found most interesting in this book, actually, which I refer to frequently, is a letter that Edinger wrote to the LA Times after the Oklahoma City bombing. Let me just read this. This is from the editor's preface. I should note, however, that the author's concern for apocalyptic issues is not new, since the second half of Jung's answer to Job deals with Revelation. Edinger had to comment upon it in his own work, Transformation of the God Image, an elucidation of Jung's answer to Job. And the author was really in the realm of apocalypse in his study, The New God Image, Goethe's Faust, and the seminal essay entitled The New Myth in the Creation of Consciousness. The timing of these 10 lectures on the specific topic of the archetype of the apocalypse in early 1995, however, became shockingly apt. So this book is 10 lectures that he gave in Los Angeles in early 1995. Within a month of their delivery, there occurred the nation's worst terrorist attack. The federal building in Oklahoma City was bombed by an American possessed by the archetypal idea that the 168 men, women, and children he killed and the hundreds he wounded were part of an evil empire. He killed them also in revenge for the 2 deaths 2 years earlier. Or not 2 deaths. He killed them also in revenge for the deaths 2 years earlier of 80 persons of an apocalyptic cult killed in a fiery blaze in Waco, Texas. Deeply moved, Edinger wrote in his city's newspaper the following letter entitled The Psychology of Terrorism. Quote, "Terrorism is a manifestation of the psyche. It is time we recognize the psyche as an autonomous factor in world affairs. The psychological root of terrorism is a fanatical resentment, a quasi-psychotic hatred originating in the depths of the archetypal psyche and therefore carried by religious archetypal energies. A classic literary example is Melville's Moby Dick. Captain Ahab, with his fanatic hatred of the white whale, is a paradigm of the modern terrorist. Articulate terrorists generally express themselves in religious archetypal terminology. The enemy is seen as the principle of objective evil, the devil, and the terrorist perceives himself as the heroic agent of divine or objective justice, God. This is an archetypal inflation of demonic proportions, which temporarily grants the individual almost superhuman energy and effectiveness. To deal with terrorism effectively, we must understand it. We need a new category to understand this new phenomenon. These individuals are not criminals and are not madmen, although they have some qualities of both. Let's call them zealots. Zealots are possessed by transpersonal archetypal dynamisms deriving from the collective unconscious. Their goal is a collective, not a personal one. The criminal seeks his own personal gain, not so the zealot. In the name of a transpersonal collective value, a religion, an ethnic or national identity, a patriotic vision, etc., they sacrifice their personal life in the service of their, quote, God, unquote. Although idiosyncratic and perverse, this is fundamentally a religious phenomenon that derives from the archetypal collective unconscious. Sadly, the much-needed knowledge of this level of the psyche is not generally available. For those interested in seeking it, I recommend a serious study of the psychology of C.G. Jung. Unquote. As a sign of the times, this letter was not published. Instead, the nation was deluged with mere descriptions of the horror, along with biographies of the suspects, with hardly a line of print or moment of television dedicated to understanding what had happened. The governor of Oklahoma would say at a memorial service, quote, "We can't understand why it happened," unquote. Billy Graham, Baptist chaplain to the nation, had already confessed on national television before a crowd of weeping survivors that he did not know why God allows things like this to happen. Nobody seems to know what is going on, yet Edinger's book bravely tells us. And so that's a pretty significant point, because we still have it in this very week we're in. Anyway, let me go back. Okay, I'm seeing no new chat here. Do I have any other thoughts? I've talked quite a bit about meaning and also about the pitfall of materialism, so I think I'll leave that out for the moment. But I wanted to emphasize that Dr. Jung was very emphatic that we have to live this life, not some future life after death. And Buddhism offers the same ideas, and so the big four thoughts in Buddhism are the beauty of birth, the certainty of death, the fact that all life is samsara, meaning all life is suffering. We're problem-solving creatures, and we have to solve problems our whole life. We do it every day, all day long. And if you think about your life in that way, you can understand what I'm talking about. And the fourth item is karma, which is a Buddhist term which basically means what goes around comes around. In other words, if you do nasty things to others, that's going to come back and bite you. And I have found that karma is absolutely perfect in its operation. And so whenever I have a vengeful thought towards someone, I am able to let it go because I know that karma is going to come get that person at some point, and they're going to pay for their whatever they did to me that I didn't like. And there have been a few things. Okay, so one of the issues that comes along here in connection with religion and Dr. Jung is that he's accused of being a Gnostic, and that's not quite right, because basically the only things we know about the Gnostics were written by their enemies, the Catholic Church, who kept good records of the people they hated and thought were heretics. But we don't have the materials of the Gnostics themselves, or not very many of them. Some of them have been found since Jung's life. But just to explain so that you understand the distinction, Gnosticism was about having a direct experience with God. And we've talked about that in this group a number of times. And, you know, I'll mention an example. It's about having a living experience with God, which is not a pastor explaining God to you or talking about how wonderful he is. It's really about an actual experience. And I'm sure many of you will remember this image that I took. I took this in the Naval Academy Chapel, and I had gone in there to contemplate after I was having some personal difficulties, and it was quite dark in the morning. This was at 10:30 in the morning, and so the whole chapel was pretty dark, and yet all of a sudden this light came down and it shined only on me, and it completely changed my mood. And so I'll give you what happened next. Okay, so here's me. I was so stunned by the fact that this light had come on me that I knew nobody would believe it unless I had pictures. And so I got out my trusty cell phone and took a selfie. And you can see by the smile on my face how my mood has changed. And you can also see how dark it is in the chapel. I'll just go back to that for a moment. And so I count that as a direct religious experience as it applied to me. It doesn't mean that you would be moved in the same way I was. It had to do with my psychological state at the time. But it was very much, for me, it was a religious experience. And this is the sort of thing that Gnosticism is talking about. I had no pastor involved. I never talked about that incident with a pastor. And I've talked about this extensively on the channel. So if you look at Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, that's the name of the playlist, you can find some other examples. But you're going to have your own experiences. and probably have had and maybe didn't understand them. And so that's a direct experience with the God image or God. And that's what Gnosticism was talking about. Now, the church wanted to interpose itself between the parishioner and God because they wanted to make it into a profession, which they did. And that sort of directed Western development for the next 2,000 years. But, if you hear a pastor say, "Oh, well, I don't pay any attention to Jung because he's a Gnostic," please set them straight on that, because Dr. Jung provided Christian theologians especially, but other theologians as well, with the basis and reality of their very religions, and they need to understand what he did for them. Jonathan says, "As you showed me this when I asked you about synchronicity last time I watched." Okay. So I do show it every so often, just because I happen to have it on my OBS system. Okay, so this evening was to be dedicated to, this is the second evening in which I'm trying to give an overview of Jung's thought, and so there are a few other random things that I wanted to talk about, and they aren't directly related to religion per se, but you need to be aware of them in a general context. Okay, so the first of these is the collective unconscious, and some of you may have noticed that yesterday I did a video showing how an archetype emerges from the collective unconscious, and I used as an example Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so without speaking about her position, or her political positions, or anything else, there's no denying the fact that she's an example of this archetype that's pushed up from the collective unconscious, because it means that the unconscious of the collective, in this case the United States, is looking for something, either as a friend or an enemy. And so ironically, it's actually the GOP as her enemy who've really pushed her up into the limelight. And so that is an example of an archetype coming up from the collective unconscious. And it really has nothing to do with AOC herself, her human self. It has to do with her as a symbol of something that society is looking for, either to shout down, which is what the GOP is trying to do with her, or to follow, which is what many Democrats are trying to do with her. But anyway, that video that I put online yesterday has already had over 500 hits. And so it's quite obvious that I hit a vein there. And that really is, a proof of what I'm talking about. I'm planning, hopefully later this week or early next week, to do another one on Beto O'Rourke, because I think that he is going to he is in the process of being pushed up. We heard this morning that on his first day in his campaign, he brought in more money than any other presidential candidate in this round, $6.1 million in the first 24 hours, and even Bernie Sanders only brought in 5.9. So it's quite obvious that to the collective, Beto O'Rourke also represents something. I'm not saying what just yet, but anyway, it's incredible to see how these things happen. And Tor, leaving aside what you may think about him politically, I'm only talking about the phenomenon. I'm trying to help everyone understand the phenomenon and how these things, these people get pushed up by the collective, for better or for worse. I mean, it also happened with Donald Trump in the last election, where he too played an archetype. He was the trickster, and he got pushed up into the limelight as a result of that, and he used it very effectively. And so when I'm talking about the collective unconscious, I'm talking about something that all of us share, and it can relate to different organizations. So there's an unconscious in the family, which we'll talk about a rebus in a moment, but it also is in groups. I often talk of the Marine Corps, and there is something in all Marines, and the saying is, once a Marine, always a Marine. And I can't tell you what it is. It's not that it's a secret. It's an unconscious collective attitude that I can't share with you because I couldn't possibly explain it to you. So it also applies to states, to nations, and to humanity itself. So that's a brief discussion of the collective unconscious. It also relates, by the way, to alchemy, which is about how you put ingredients into the psyche or into the collective. And as one of my mentors once said, every time I add someone to a group or take someone out, it changes the group. And so that's true of the group, whether the group is 3 people or a whole nation or humanity itself. That's what the collective does. Okay, so Tor thinks Beto is terrible and worse than Mike Pence. Truth Convoy says he is a creep, totally corrupt, and no, not collective, a certain group, not a genuine collective. Well, it's some collective, because both the Republicans and the Democrats are pushing him into prominence. And so that's what I'm describing. I'm describing an archetype being pushed up out of the collective unconscious. And I'm trying to make you, my followers, understand what that concept is so that you can recognize it. I'm not taking any position on Beto's appropriateness to be president of the United States, or AOC for that matter being anything other than a congresswoman for the next 2 years. And then she has to be reelected. Truth says media is manipulated. Yes, I agree with that. But Truth Convoy, when you say it's a certain group, not a genuine collective, I think it's not just a certain group, because it comes from both the love and the hate side. This is what we're talking about in Mysterium Conjunctionis in our seminar on Wednesdays, that things either are drawn together or they're pushed apart. And that's the opposites, which are the source of psychic energy. And so in both of these cases, the 2 cases that I've given you, it's both those who hate her and those who love her. And the same with, in the case of Beto, those who hate him and those who love him, both are pushing them into prominence out of the collective. So that's my point. Whether you agree with me, I can't, I don't want to argue with you. I'm only trying to make you understand a psychological fact that comes from Dr. Jung. Jonathan says, maybe he acquired this money illegitimately. I would have no idea. Truth, no, we do not share. Share what? We do not share in the collective of us who do not share your delusion. Okay, I don't know who you're talking about. If you're talking about me being deluded, fine, that's your opinion. Taurus says, I get it with AOC or Tulsi. They are lively, yeah. And Truth says, but most ignore him. We'll see. He's just begun. Jerome says, people projecting need for a savior or personality cult. Yeah, that's the archetype that I think is coming up. And in fact, somewhere here, yes, I actually have the archetype here, which I'll be talking about. It's a long piece, but it's actually also referred to as the Avenger, the avenging angel, the savior, or Messiah. This archetype and its related manifestations responds to a need to balance the scales of justice, sometimes by employing aggressive techniques. Attorneys who work for the impoverished or disadvantaged, or who volunteer part of their time for pro bono work, are modern avengers. Anyway, I'm not going to read all that to you, because then that'll steal my thunder for my video later in the week. But yes, I think the savior archetype is what we're talking about and what people are unconsciously looking for. Taurus says, politicians in Europe suck too, but it's noticeable worse in USA. Trump gets elected here, and oligarch types, but not the O'Rourke types. They are so much persona. But the fact is, we who are not part of your group do exist. You marginalize the other. The true collective runs deeper than your political parties. Well, I'm not marginalizing you. You don't have to agree with me, certainly. And yes, the true collective runs deeper. And come the primaries and election day, we'll know what the result is. We don't know it now. Art says, hi, Skip. I was late. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the collective unconscious at the moment, but I'm going to move on and just talk about yin yang for a moment from Taoism, since it represents, and unfortunately I don't have a yin yang symbol here on my OBS tonight, so I'll just ask you to imagine the circle with the S-shaped divider and the black side and the white side with the little dot in each one, representing some of the opposite is in both sides, and that symbol represents all psychological opposites. And I was accused in the last couple of days by one woman who said that educated men cannot possibly and never do understand women, and that's correct. I mean, there's I've often shown my cup that has the statement, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer is yes, he is, because there's two sides to the to all equations. And so he does not represent both sides. He represents only one. And so this is true in all duality, in all opposites. And but understanding that is very helpful, because then you know that you can't necessarily expect your husband or wife to see things the way you do. And so when that woman made that comment that educated men can't understand women, which was actually the point that I was making in the video, because I was in that video, I was talking about my novel and the fact that I had written a novel about the individuation of a woman, but that I had used the pattern that was written by a woman, namely Clarissa Pinkola Estes, acknowledging that I cannot understand women. And so my response to her statement was yes, and vice versa, vive la différence. So for what it's worth. Truth Convoy, thank you for the yin yang symbol. That's helpful. Okay, moving on. The next point that I wanted to mention was rebus, and that's R-E-B-I-S. It's not rebus. Rebus is also where you can have a prose writing, except every so often you put some image or emoticon in place of a word. That's also a rebus, but I think that's R-E-B-U-S, but this is a psychological rebus. And what that rebus relates to is the fact that unconsciously, when you are in any relationship, not only spousal relationships, but any relationship, including this one, including this group, you have a certain something that you know as a group that no one else knows, and so it's only you that knows what has gone on and what the value of this group is. If you're new to this group, it'll take you a while to get accepted into the rebus, but the same thing applies to marriages especially. And Billy Joel wrote a terrific song about this when he was breaking up with Christy Brinkley, and it begins with a phrase, "In every heart there is a room," and it has the chorus, "And you're the only one who knows," and that's because certain things happen between husband and wife that can't possibly be expressed to others, and that's your rebus. And if that is strong, then you will have a strong marriage. If it's not strong, you won't. As I indicated earlier, the same applies to things like the Marines or any group you're part of, an office group, let's say. They all develop a certain psyche that relates to you as a group, and you're the only one who knows. You and your fellow group members are the only ones who know. Okay, so I guess that's clear on rebus. So the next point is to talk about synchronicity. Now, synchronicity is a big topic in Jungian psychology, and it relates in part to religious experiences. So the one that I showed you a little earlier would be an example. And basically, synchronicity occurs when your psyche is open for something to happen, whatever it is. And then something does happen, and your psyche connects with that. whatever it is. And so you saw in that particular example that I showed you earlier, how that changed my psychic attitude instantaneously when it happened. And it was an incident that lasted not more than 30 seconds before the sun moved on. But in that 30-second period, the sun just shone on me in that chapel, in that place, over the Tiffany window at the U.S. Naval Academy. And so it had tremendous significance to me personally. You have to get your own. I can't help you get a religious experience, but anyway, they come up very often because of synchronicity, where your psyche is ready for something. And it might be ready for it for a decade, who knows? But then suddenly it comes along and your psyche says, aha, yeah, that's it. And so that's a synchronous event. And that's what synchronicity is. And so Dr. Jung called it an acausal connecting principle. In other words, it's not cause and effect. It's irrational, but it comes from the unconscious and makes these things happen. So that's a sort of my brief summary of synchronicity. And then the next idea is the point of spirit in man. And so for that, I would refer you back to my discussion of Mercurius, which was in earlier sessions of the reading group. And you can find it, it was, I guess, about August or September of last year that I was talking about Mercurius and talking about the spirit coming through and how it comes through in art and religion. It's also mentioned heavily in the UFO essay, which I read last week. So you can find a playlist. That essay is 120 pages long, and so I read it over 8 different videos, I think, and I made a playlist of them, which you can find through the YouTube channel. But all of these things, Mercurius especially, but other writings do refer to the spirit in man. Then I want to talk about Mysterium Conjunctionis. And the significance of Mysterium Conjunctionis, among other things, is that it is talking about the significance of images that go back to primal periods. And Dr. Jung realized about 100 years ago that images that he was seeing in the dreams of his patients had also appeared in alchemy 300 or 400 years earlier, going back all the way to the 2nd or 3rd century when alchemy began. And so these images are in the DNA, basically. They're in your deep unconscious. And so they're the same in all human beings. And so Mysterium Conjunctionis is a book which is discussing these images one by one. And and that's one of the main topics of Mysterium. The other main topic is the opposites, and whether they're love or hate. They can be either one. But anyway, that is a seminar that we're running over this coming year. We've done, I think, 6 sessions already. All of those are in the Dropbox for the advanced reading group. If you want to join the advanced reading group, we already have online 32 sessions that we did on Ion, and we have 6 now on Mysterium. So it's not necessary that you physically participate. We would love to have you physically participate. We run the seminar at 1:30 every Wednesday, U.S. Eastern Time, and we may have a problem this week because they're replacing the siding on the building that I live in. So we'll see if they get to me before the advanced reading group seminar. But anyway, that's something that we have to deal with. Nonetheless, if you would like to join the advanced reading group and then have access to the entire Ion seminar of 32 sessions, so I would say that's about 50 hours of material, and the Mysterium sessions as they come up, you can watch them in replay, although we'd love to have you also live. We do it on Zoom. You would be welcome. You can write to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I'll just put my email address onto the chat so you have that readily available. Okay. Okay. All right. So the significant one other reason why Dr. Jung was referring back to the alchemical images, which were in books of alchemy, was that they are images that came up before what he called epistemological criticism. And so they came up before a tradition which we now have everywhere, where somebody writes a book or makes a movie, and immediately you have criticism or critics, and well and good, but the point was that there was no epistemological criticism at the time that the alchemists were doing their work in secret, and so their images are basically purer images than ours would be, because we might tend to hold back and not tell our therapist exactly what's going on. But the alchemists didn't hold back. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for a picture that I wanted to share with you here. So, for example, here's an image that reflects the opposites, with this woman standing in two basins, I guess, and they represent the opposites, light and dark, and so on. And that one's not there. I'm just looking for another one that's, I know it's here because, there it is. Here it is. Okay. Okay, I gotta get rid of this lady. There she is. Oh no, this isn't it, but this is another one. Okay, so this is the prima materia as dragon. Okay, so this was an image that developed in those early days of alchemy, and so nobody can criticize it theoretically, or did criticize it. So it has more purity than something we would see today. I'm sorry, I'm not finding the other one. Oh, wait a minute. Is this it? Yes, here it is. Okay, this is actually my favorite one. This appears in Esther Harding's book, Psychic Energy. And so here you see the dragons that represent the instincts, and they're bottled up in the unconscious and and around them is civilization built up based on the psychic energy of the unconscious. And so that's actually my favorite one. Let's see. All right. Okay, so then I wanted to talk a bit about divination. Okay, and so various divination techniques are available. Astrology is probably the one that's best known in the West, but we also have the tarot and all kinds of prophecy and all kinds of, reading Ouija boards and what have you. And, Jung was criticized for dealing with the occult, but what he was doing with the occult was only talking about what their psychic, where they came from, number one, because they've always been around, and you can probably find an astrology column in your newspaper today, and so they've had importance to a lot of human beings all over the world. I mean, there's obviously Chinese astrology and many other versions, and so all of these things tend to operate based on synchronicities. And so what it means is that I'm not terribly familiar with astrology, but I do know that if I go into a Chinese restaurant and look on the placemat, which would have the 12 images of the Chinese zodiac, if I look up my birth year, which is a dog year, and read the description of a dog year person, it pretty much describes me. So, somehow over thousands of years, these things have gathered to themselves truths that we can't consciously explain, but nonetheless they are true. And, I've found that those zodiac signs, those Chinese zodiac signs, do apply even to Westerners and to me. And as I've said with the tarot, since I do tarot readings sometimes, what they relate to, the major arcana relate to the major archetypal events of life. And so, and they're in the order of the major archetypal events of life, right up to wholeness. The first 10 are about, your physical life, and the last 10 are about your spiritual life. And what they do is they connect, when I do a reading, what the things that I say, some of them will connect to something that's a hook in your unconscious. And so I've often boasted and said that if I had a tarot deck and I just threw it across a stage in a theater that has 1,500 people or 1,000 people in it, and just do a reading off the stage with no layout whatsoever, everyone in the room will think I did the reading for them. But everyone will hear a different reading, because if I say something about the Empress card, which refers to mother, for example, everybody's got a mother. And so if you happen to be having a good time or a bad time with your mother, depending on what you hear me say about it, you'll connect with that part of the reading. And so a tarot reader would, out of maybe 10 cards they might read, if they're doing a fairly full reading, one that you would commonly get at a county fair or something like that, they're going to connect with 3 to 5, maybe 6 things in your psyche, no matter who you are. And you can't deny that because those things are in your psyche. So the other cards, the 58 other cards, are, I'm sorry, it's 56 other cards, are called the minor arcana, and they are typical experiences of life based on the psychological types that you find in Jungian psychology: sensing, intuitive, thinking, and feeling. That's what those cards connect up to. And so, again, it's a synchronicity. So you've got a hook that relates only to you in your unconscious, and you're connecting with something that's happening in your environment, namely something that's read to you. And with astrology, you probably know, if you read the astrology column in the newspaper, maybe that astrology column will nail your life twice a year. And it's those those columns that you remember, and you tend to forget the ones that didn't connect. So let me just look back. So info overdose says, how do you guys use Carl Jung's teachings in your life? And Mallory says, that is an expansive question. Speaking for myself, obviously, I use it as a guide to my life because I'm spending quite a bit of time on this YouTube channel these days. And but the main way that I have found that it has worked for me over the last 32 years is that we all require psychic healing. Okay, we're all broken mentally, whether we admit it or not. And, some of you may feel nihilistic or whatever. I don't know who or how you feel at any given time. But the way it's worked for me is that, whenever I'm having a hard time, for example, the time I went to the Naval Academy, I decided to go meditate in a sacred place, namely the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy. That was based on some of the things that I've learned from Dr. Jung, and it often makes me feel better. And so even if I'm not just meditating, I use the readings, and it doesn't matter what I read. If what happens is, I think that I tend to drop myself into the psychoid layer. And once you're in the psychoid layer, which has been discussed on this channel, and so you can find it by putting the word psychoid into the search, and you'll probably get a few videos that I've done on the psychoid layer. But I think that what's happening from a psychological point of view is that anytime I'm reading Dr. Jung's work, I'm reading about something that's archetypal, and it tends to drop me into the psychoid layer. And once you're in the psychoid layer, that's where psychic healing can take place. And so I in no way am trying to take the rice bowl of psychotherapists, because I'm not a mental health professional. But most of us can't afford their work, and especially Jungian analysts are quite expensive, and so most of us can't afford an analysis by a Jungian analyst. But I find that by reading Dr. Jung's work, I basically get mental health help that way. It's a kind of self-help, so that's how I use it. And so one other point here is child psychology. And Dr. Jung did not talk very much about child psychology. He wasn't very interested in children per se. Um, and that is because of his view that during the first half of life, you're basically just doing research. That's the way he put it. You're learning how to be a human being, and you start doing that from the minute you're born, and you keep observing what your parents are doing or whatever, and that gradually, the light gradually comes on, consciousness gradually arrives, and so you learn to speak your native language, and then, all of education is about raising consciousness, but you can't keep going to school forever. And if you keep going to school forever and don't go out into the world, then what's it for? What's all that consciousness for? And so, Dr. Jung himself did not do much on child psychology, but two of his disciples did. One was Erich Neumann, who did a couple of interesting books, both on child psychology and the Great Mother archetype. And the other one was Sabine Spielrein. And Sabine had been Jung's patient before the Red Book period, and probably had a love affair with him in the pre-1910 time frame, and that's covered in the movie A Dangerous Method. If you look at the fourth video that I did, or the fourth session that I did in year one, so it's in the playlist called JRG1 for Jung Reading Group 1, and it's session number 4. You'll hear my discussion of A Dangerous Method if you want to hear that. But so Jung's point was that during the first half of life, you're learning about the physical world and how to support yourself, and how to reproduce, and how to raise children and those sorts of things. And it's in the second half of life that you have to address the unconscious part of your life, and that's the spiritual part. And so that's why he was focused mostly on that, and why he was focused heavily on religion, because that's what's happening in the second half of life. And of course, his father had been a Swiss Reformed pastor who had lost his faith, and meanwhile, Jung himself was having religious experiences from age 5. And so he was trying to connect up this dissociation between his pastor father, who had lost his faith, and his personal religious experiences, many of which were not that commendable, because his most famous dream is when he was 11 years old, and he had the vision of God taking a dump on the Cathedral of Basel and destroying it. And so he really wanted to figure out what that was all about, and understandably so. And so that got him interested in this second half of life issue. So, any other thoughts? Let's see. Art says, I call it being led by the Spirit. Okay, that's a good way to think of it. Info overdose. Thoughts on Jordan Peterson? Well, I haven't seen that much of Jordan's recent work. in general, I learn a lot from Jordan Peterson. I never studied psychology. When I was in college, I have his book right here, the Maps of Meaning book. It's a very tightly written book, and so you really need to, let me try to get the focus better. You really need to watch his videos on Maps of Meaning to understand it. If you've studied psychology in the past, you can probably get a lot out of it, but it's very, very tightly packed. He said that he went over every sentence 15 or 20 times, and it really shows, but it is almost impenetrable, I think, for the average layman. Now, the 12 Rules of Life is easier to read and understand, but I developed a resistance to it, mainly because it focuses on rationality and paternalism. And I think that if you focus only on rationality in your life, you're going to end up not having a very happy life. And this is an example. Okay, so this is, I've talked about this before, but this is a 63-foot motor yacht called Never Enough. And so I know from my own experience that when you have a yacht or a sailboat or a motor boat, as soon as you put it in the water, you want something bigger, and you think that'll make you happy, but actually it won't. And so here's a fellow who's got this nice yacht, but as you see, the yacht is tied up at the dock, and he is not out in it. And so you can't, if you're going to live your life by keeping up with the Joneses and by materialism, you're not going to find spiritual happiness at the end of your life. And so it's you're very wise if you start to focus on what Dr. Jung was talking about spiritual happiness in your life, and not materialism, because you'll never have enough no matter what you get. I mean, okay, you have a Mercedes, terrific. Are you going to have a Bentley next? And will it need oil changes too? Where does it end? And in fact, my Prius that gets 55 miles to the gallon works just fine, and that's probably even more car than I need. It certainly is way better than any car I had in my youth. Even my mother-in-law has a 2003 Honda Civic, believe it or not, with less than 60,000 miles on it in that 16-year period. And, but that car has automatic windows in it. And let's see, when did I get my first car with automatic windows? I think it was not until I moved to Japan in 1980. And so, but the cars I had before then worked just as well and perfectly well. So that's what you have to think about. And so, and just to wrap up on Jordan Peterson then, 99.5% of everything he says I agree with, to the extent that he emphasizes rigid rationalism or paternalism. That's where I get off the bus. And because you need more than that. You need more than rules in your life. You need to live a life. And that means what Jung was talking about in the Jaffe book, which is you have to go out and make mistakes. You have to make errors. And your errors are probably going to be because you violated some rule. But, that's the way it is. That's how you learn. So anyway, my comments. Mallory says, JP seems popularity misunderstood like most Jung that gets attention. Maybe that's true, yes. Info overdose. So would you say Jung's core message is to discover hidden parts of yourself and use them in an ethical way? An example would be the shadow integration. Well, certainly shadow integration is a fundamental aspect of Jungian psychology. But the most, taken down to its essence, Jungian psychology is about individuation and you living the fullest life you can live. And so that discussion at the beginning of this in terms of Christ and how he lived his life to the fullest, according to what his self was telling him, that's what we should all be doing. And so again, I'll put up Edinger's little diagram here. Yourself is the boss. Okay, that's your God image, and yourself is going to tell you what to do. Okay, you can't tell me what you're going to be doing 2 minutes from now, and I can't tell you what I will be saying 2 minutes from now. That all comes from the self. And so that's personality number 2. And typically when I'm in one of these sessions, I'm in personality number 2. So I'm giving it to you straight from the source, what I think, and without too much of my ego interfering. I mean, obviously it does to a certain extent, but so, if you understand this diagram, you're going to understand a lot about Jungian psychology, absolutely. Frank Witt says, what other works do you recommend regarding shadow work in practice? Sadly, Dr. Jung didn't talk a lot about the shadow in a separate work. There are books about the shadow by Jungian analysts, and in Ion, there is a chapter on the shadow, and I've actually read that chapter. It's chapter I think it's chapter 3, but it might be chapter 2 of Ion. And so you can find one concise statement of the shadow there. Let's see. No, I don't have it here. But otherwise, I would look for various Jungian analysts that have written separately about the shadow, because Jung didn't really clearly define it. He basically said the shadow is all the, you have your personality type and all the inferior types that match up with your personality. So if you're sensing and you're inferior on your intuitive side, that would be your shadow, and vice versa. And so if you're a thinking person, as I am, then my shadow is my feeling side, and so I don't necessarily get it when someone has an emotional reaction to something I say. And I am very far out on the intuitive scale, and so a sensing person that needs a lot of facts, I am totally blind in the sense that I do not understand why they don't understand what I'm saying. I mean, it's as simple as that. I intuit many things, and my easy way of saying it is a sensing person, you can show them 1,000 trees and they won't believe there's a forest. An intuitive person, you can show them 3 trees and they assume there's a forest. So since I'm on the 3-tree end of the spectrum, I don't know how many trees I have to show you before you'll get it, what I'm talking about. And so that's my blindness, so that's my shadow, and that's a serious one. Okay, let's see. Mallory says, Dark Side of the Light Chasers is pretty decent and contemporary. The Light Side of the Dark Chasers, too. Every criminal in a movie probably has a light side, too. If you think of The Godfather, for example, The Godfather was on the dark side, but because he was running a criminal enterprise and he murdered people, etc., but he had certain light aspects, which is why he became the Godfather. People wanted him to be the godfather of their children. And Mallory says, Owning Your Own Shadow is a sharp little book. So I take a look at that. There are quite a number of them. I'm just wondering if I have another one here. I don't know. If you put The Shadow into Amazon, you'll find lots. So Info says, thoughts on Jung's BBC interview Face to Face. Well, that's an 1.5-hour interview, and we're over time, so I'm not going to be able to give you a detailed analysis of it. What I would say is that I did have an epiphany when he said to, I think it's John Anderson, he said, I have no need to believe, I know. And the point is that once you've had a true religious experience, then you know, then you don't need a creed. And, I'd refer you to, again, to one of Edinger's lectures, which you can hear. I think it's this one, which is Individuation, Myth for Modern Man. Okay, so these are pointers to my transcripts of these lectures, but I've also put the link to the videos so that you can actually listen. It's not a video, it's actually an audible. And then the other one is Encounters with the Greater Personality, which is about religious experiences. So you can also take a look at those two lectures because they're very good in terms of orienting you in Jungian psychology. Frank Witt says, thanks for your time. Well, thank you. Okay, so also, let's see. The other thing that sticks out from that BBC interview is when he says, the world hangs by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. He says, nowadays we're not threatened by natural disasters, but the psyche of man, at the time he was speaking, had brought World Wars I and II and many other catastrophes that he had studied over his 50 years of writing. And so, the thin thread, he was referring to the problem of nuclear weapons at the time, which was seeming very real at the time. It was it was within 8 years of when the Soviet Union had tested their first H-bomb. And so he believed, and He believed at the time of his death in 1961, which was before the Cuban Missile Crisis, that humanity might actually exterminate itself. And we might, because scientists have since told us that if only 23, I think it's 23 nuclear weapons are detonated in the atmosphere on Earth, then we'll kill all living beings on the Earth. And so, that's a big potential catastrophe for Mother Earth, because Mother Earth won't have conscious beings on it anymore. And so he gave us the warning. And, so did the Oracle of Delphi, who said, know thyself. And so what we talk about every Monday evening and every Wednesday in these seminars is knowing yourself and knowing the way your psyche works, and the fact that your psyche is an objective fact, and it's a universe that's unique to you. It's every bit as big as the universe that's out there, maybe bigger. And so it's worthwhile to understand these things and be able to share them with others, so that hopefully the people that do have their fingers on the triggers won't pull them and cause humanity to be destroyed. Okay, I guess I've covered your point, info overdose. I'm not sure what the question was, but if I've covered it, that's great. Info. And Truth Convoy says, I have been accused of weaponizing Tarot. Well, if you read Tarot in a certain way, it can be weaponized, very definitely. And then that comes down to an ethical question. And that's the other big thing that Jung's psychology is about, which is that, well, if the traditional religions, the myths of the traditional religions are wrong, then what gives us our ethics? And Jung believed that we have an ethical essence, let's say, in our unconscious, and that is seen us through. But, if you consider the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, well, if you're going to follow that commandment explicitly, then you can't go to any grocery store, because everything that's in that grocery store was once alive. And as the Buddhists point out, all life lives on other life. And so, you have to take all these things with a grain of salt. If you see the movie Florence Foster Jenkins, for example, thou shalt not commit adultery. But her husband, who's played by Hugh Grant, was committing adultery all the time, because Florence Foster Jenkins got syphilis from her father when she was very young. And so she had syphilis, and her husband never made love to her. And, the same is true of Lady Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny Jerome. She was a Baltimore girl. I think she was from Baltimore. But anyway, she was an American. And Lord Randolph Churchill got syphilis on his wedding night. And when it became obvious 3 to 4 weeks later, and during its incubation period, after that, Jenny Jerome never made love with him again, and she had lots of love affairs around town. Well, Is she okay because she committed that adultery? Yeah, I don't know. And also, Emma Jung's father had syphilis, and one of the reasons that Jung got to know her, because she was one of the wealthiest women in Europe, the wealthiest in Switzerland, I think, at the time they married, it was because her father had syphilis. So, you have to take all these things with a grain of salt and make ethical decisions. And, just because, a religion gives you 10 commandments doesn't mean that those 10 commandments can be followed explicitly, because if you can't kill, then you can't eat anything, and then you can't live. So anyway, so I don't understand the point the Truth Convoy is making about I read on QAnon. Q followers got mad at me. I don't know what that means. But when public ideas like Q develop personalities, I think they can be included in tarot readings. Just experimenting with it is interesting. Well, okay, any reading of the tarot is going to, oh, I see. You read a tarot, you did a tarot reading on QAnon, and I don't know what QAnon is, so I'm going to leave that. And so thank you, Mallory. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. We've got 2 hours and 20 minutes we've done tonight. So I will be back next Monday, and for the advanced reading group, we'll be on at 1:30 U.S. Eastern Time on Wednesday. If you're not a member of the advanced reading group, where we've got seminars on Ion and Mysterium Conjunctionis, please write to me and we'll get you set up. So talk to you soon. Thank you for coming this evening. And info over said, how did I discover Jung? Well, I discovered Jung from an anima figure in 1987. I think I spoke about that at length another time, but I'll answer it again, but not tonight because my voice is finished. So